Hey, happy Friday, and you know what that means. It is time to talk about a book, and if you don't know what that means, I'm sure, one, you've probably put the pieces together based on the thumbnail and title, but two, hi, my name is Melody, and on Fridays we generally dive deeper, talk about a book more specifically, whether you want to call it a review, whether you want to call it a chat, however you want to frame it. That is what we do on Fridays, and I would love for you to hang out more if you are interested in not only book chats, but anything kind of book adjacent. That is what you will find here. So go ahead and like and subscribe, I guess, if you feel like it. But today we are talking about Where the Dead Brides Gather by Nuzo Onoh, which is a kind of horror novel that came out in the fall and was one of the months that I missed talking about my anticipated releases, but this was an anticipated release, or at least I think it was a month where I forgot to talk about my anticipated releases. Now, what drew me to this book was this concept of a liminal space, as well as this idea of possession and ghost brides. Not like in The Ghost Bride by Yang Zichu, which I also loved, but also there are some parallels in terms of the kind of mythicism built up around being a bride, and also the emphasis put on being a bride, in this case within Nigerian culture, as this book is set in a small community in Nigeria in the 70s, and we are following the perspective of a young girl, Bata, which I will admit I missed in my first view of the blurb, or at least my brain didn't latch onto that context. So I thought we were going to be following a much older protagonist, and so we are seeing everything through the eyes of a child. Now, with that being said, this is not a book for children by any means, but it's interesting if we are thinking in context of this emphasis and kind of centralization of the idea of brides that goes beyond the title, I promise, and we will get to it. It's interesting to be exploring this from the perspective of a young girl, and this isn't a long book. It is shy of 300 pages, but it feels like a lot happens in this book, and I never anticipated where we were going to be going, because I really thought we were going to be spending a lot of our time in this kind of liminal space, alternate realm of the dead brides, and we didn't actually spend as much time there as I anticipated, and honestly, it was actually my least favorite part of the book at the end of the day. But while at no point could I really anticipate where we were going until things started to kind of come together at the end, they definitely came together at the end. And so we start on the eve of sorts of Bata's cousin's wedding, which is going to be a big event and going to allow Bata a kind of celebration. It's something a child would look forward to, especially a child who is usually stuck in the house with her mother and her stepmother and her older sister, who is usually fighting with her stepmother, and her stepmother's child, who her mother spends most of her time raising, because her stepmother is kind of like the prized wife and is really treasured for her beauty, but doesn't really have a whole lot of responsibilities because of that. And so Bata's mother spends a lot of time raising her triplet younger brothers, and Bata spends a lot of time with the brothers as well, but she also spends a lot of time and really looks up to her stepmother in a lot of ways, who kind of clashes with Bata's older sister for some of the same reasons that Bata is drawn to her, because she sees her stepmother as a very glamorous figure, and her stepmother is always talking about going to Lagos, just correcting myself, to Lagos real quick, and studying, and Bata is very interested in school and becoming educated and going to the big city, and also her stepmother is always carrying around Mills and Boon books, which we have the context of, which I also think becomes a really interesting character detail later and really important to some of the conversations the book is having that aren't as evident right away, I don't think. And I've sat with this a couple days, and I would never pretend to have fully unpacked this story and what it is exploring and what it is saying. And also, I don't think I will ever be able to fully unpack it myself, just because I don't have all of the cultural context that is also clearly feeding into this in really interesting ways, because it's told kind of like a folk tale in some ways as well, in terms of the writing style even, even as we are in Bata's head and we do get a sense of her kind of emotional interior. I'm not gonna lie to you, I went to check on a casserole in the oven and I have lost my exact train of thought. However, I sat with this for a couple of days and it is a lot deeper than it first appears, I think. But I also found it interesting on a kind of overarching level before we get back to Bata and her adventure, the kind of thematic and kind of religious kind of worldview clashes within the narrative as well, because we have this supernatural exploration that is at the heart of this narrative, and we also have Bata's mother, who is very religious and always kind of invoking Jesus and Mother Mary. And so like we saw with Vagabonds, which was one of my favorite books a couple of years ago, and we are getting a new book from that author this year as well, we have this kind of blending of influence within the context of the kind of cultural landscape here. And so Bata is excited about this wedding, and her mother and stepmother are going to the family compound to kind of prepare her cousin for this wedding. However, while this is a very exciting event, we get these kind of trickles that maybe not all is as it appears. For instance, we start very evocatively and wonderfully at the beginning of the book in terms of the action, with the groom having gifted his new family a horse. However, this horse has been screeching and causing a lot of uproar, which is the topic of conversation at the start of the book, which feels like an omen in whatever way, and is an omen in whatever way. And then it comes out over the course of the conversation that maybe the cousin has had to get married because she has to get married, and so her mother and stepmother are going to go help prepare the bride for her wedding day. But Bata, her sister, and brothers are going to stay at home, and this is where it's also revealed that Bata has been suffering from nightmares, night terrors really, for as long as she can remember, essentially. And when they'd kind of exhausted all of their options and everyone's sleep was suffering from Bata's nightmares, she was taken to the local medicine man by her father, which her mother didn't agree with, but they were looking for any kind of respite, and there was a brief kind of pause to her nightmares before they started again. And this is a reoccurring thing. And so when she goes to bed the night before her cousin's wedding, she has a nightmare, or what she presumes is a nightmare, because come to find out, she had essentially gone or been transferred to the family compound on the eve of her cousin's wedding and was possessed by the spirit of a ghost bride and expelled the spirit protecting her cousin, and is now the bride sentinel, basically able to protect future brides from evil spirits, particularly lost spirits of former brides or brides that never got to see their wedding day. And she protects the brides on the eve of their wedding. This is some of the folklore that feels like there's more history there that I may not know of. But that's the context of it, and the context of it stands on its own in the book. And so Bata basically is given this kind of revered position all of a sudden, and everyone wants to enlist her services. And suddenly her father is, you know, kind of pulling her front and center in a way that he really hadn't paid her attention prior, especially due to the kind of havoc she caused in the house by these nightmares, but suddenly she is prized to him again. But she ends up kind of falling ill at one of the celebrations, and her father takes her back to this medicine man, where it is revealed that she has been kind of corrupted by some of these spirits, or that they have gotten to her, which leads to her being taken away by a guardian to the land of the ghost brides in order to get a sense of what it means to be the bride sentinel. But she cannot reveal that she is the bride sentinel, otherwise she will be in danger here. And I'm not gonna lie, I expected the time in the realm of the ghost brides to be the main kind of event, and rather it felt a lot more symbolic, and in a way where it was just kind of pushing her to the next part of her journey and presenting this mythology of the ghost brides, and presenting this idea that these brides that have died before their chance to be a bride are kind of living in this limbo in a kind of Miss Havisham kind of way, but on the supernatural level, with some bits of joy. And especially from Bata's point of view, there's a lot of joy in this place, even if there's a lot of mourning from these ghost brides, where they feel kind of trapped in this existence, and their entire existence is relative to being a bride, because they are waiting in limbo in order to be called to be a bride so that their soul can kind of be absolved and reborn once they have reached that moment. And so the ghost brides that Bata is supposed to be protecting live brides from are a kind of corruption of these brides who are attempting to possess someone to be the bride then, and then kind of take over. And so there is that sense, and we run into a corrupted ghost bride even within this liminal space. But to go back to the Miss Havisham idea for a second, they are depicted as kind of sitting around, and some of them are having to get over their sadness, which makes sense when you are going into an afterlife of some kind, but a lot of them are still framing everything around this idea of their wedding. They are throwing what they anticipated their wedding to be. They are talking about their weddings, and it is brides from all kinds of different cultures all over the world, which I really loved. And within the context of this world, Bata always introduces these brides as so-and-so from such and such a place. And so we have a full cast of characters there, but the characters don't really feel deep. It's just more so-and-so from such and such a place. And so I never really felt fully engaged in this other world as I expected to. And then we were thrust out of it much quicker than I anticipated. However, it introduces this idea that then carries in to the kind of second half of the novel, where Bata is returned to her real life but has been touched by this supernatural world and is returned different in a way that is no longer appealing to her family but is a burden and an embarrassment to them, and they start hiding Bata away. Additionally, Bata develops the ability to hear thoughts, which, as a child who aims to please as she is, she thinks she is helping her family members by anticipating their needs, and she disconcerts them instead, and so they end up ostracizing her because of it, and she loses everything that she really values, including getting to go to school. And so we see her isolated. But it takes us back to this idea, and these aren't fully formed thoughts or conclusions, just things I'm pondering. The idea of ghost brides and this afterlife and these women who are framed completely within the context of being a bride and what that means. And I was trying to figure out if like the historical fiction element of it as well played into things within part of this exploration, but it really did seem to be in conversation with what a woman can dream of achieving, especially when we bring Bata's stepmother back into the picture, who becomes a much more central figure in the second half of the book for a lot of reasons I'm not going to go into for spoiler possibilities. But we see this woman who is described by many as pancake face and is kind of perceived as being very into herself and very superficial. But at the same time, her best friend is a spinster who I believe is a teacher or a librarian. Either way, she is associated with some kind of learning. And also Bata's stepmother is obsessed with this idea of learning, and it talks about Lagos all of the time and how she did so well at school there and really grasps onto these cosmopolitan ideals, though there are also conversations to be had about how she kind of positions herself in relation to whiteness in terms of those cosmopolitan ideals. But all of that is actively presented and it's explored through action without it being super obvious. But we have this character that feels like a stereotype in some ways, or is being set up as a stereotype, and even some of her actions within the second half fall into these stereotypical kind of where we would think a character like that may end up, or some of the choices she might make. But it's in conversation with this idea of your greatest accomplishment being a bride. We have this woman in her who we are seeing again through a child's point of view, and a child who has a very limited kind of sense of the world. But we have this woman who, by all accounts, has married one of the richest men in town and is very successful. But by the fact that she carries around Mills and Boon books, we can kind of speculate that she is a romantic in some way, and it is clear that this relationship isn't romantic, the relationship with Bata's father, but also she has these dreams and aspirations of something bigger, though at the end of the day, even with these dreams and aspirations, she can only kind of frame them or comprehend them within the context of, again, being a bride. Even as the bride kind of exploration inside of things feels further and further away the more we get into that latter third of the book, as Bata's kind of circumstances really devolve, as she feels much more isolated from her family, and she is constantly just battling against not being given to the medicine man as an apprentice, because this feels like the most dangerous fate to her. And so the turns that this book takes, especially in the latter third, were kind of beyond what I was anticipating. And I didn't really know what I was anticipating, I guess. I think I expected to be in that liminal space a lot more. And I think I expected the supernatural to feel a little bit more active in the way that I, as a reader, have been kind of trained to think of it. And I had to kind of reframe my expectations there and went into this and read it more. It felt like a fairy tale or a folk tale in some ways. Again, even if I don't think that that is a perfect fit. And additionally, we are in a first person point of view here, and the first person point of view of a child, which is again very limiting. But as things started to kind of ramp up in that back third and the stakes kind of amped up in a way that was a kind of slow build, I was really invested by the end, especially at some of the reversals at the end and what that said about characters and what that said about the larger conversations those characters were a part of. I thought that that was really interesting. But again, then going back to that conversation of what we can aspire to and what we can hope for, and then kind of twisting that and leaving it, for me, without spoiling the end, but leaving it at the end where marriage doesn't necessarily feel like the accomplishment, but a celebration of a particular relationship. And the relationships, I think, in here are some of the most interesting. The kind of complexities from the kind of dynamic of this family and the kind of hierarchy of this family to the turns in fortune that Bata faces and how that hierarchy is upset over the course of the novel and how it reconfigures and how this family makes sense of itself and each other within it. Even though the narrative doesn't lend itself to dwelling on these relationships, again, because we are in a kind of more sparse point of view from the eyes of a 10-year-old and 11-year-old, where her emotional interior is there, but she isn't prepared to pontificate about the kind of emotional realities of these other characters. And so we're left to get there through some deductions of some of her observations based on, you know, being adults and having a little bit more sense of the world, maybe. I mean, I clearly didn't reach all of the deductions I don't think we could have via the narrative, but I definitely think that there is a lot more there than it first appears. Now, that being said, I did struggle at parts of the book, even though it was very short. Some of it felt needlessly dense in the sense that it didn't feel like it was going anywhere at times, and I was having trouble connecting to being invested. Again, a lot of this was in that kind of middle section where it wasn't quite clear what we were building to, especially within this other realm, which felt like it just existed to kind of be fantastical a lot of the time, and then things felt like they moved very quickly there, and we were jumping time a lot in that part of the book. Bata would be like, oh yeah, it's been weeks that I've been here. And so as a reader, we didn't feel connected to that place, or at least I didn't feel connected to that place, and the way it kind of loomed in the narrative and some of the repercussions of that. So yeah, I don't know, definitely not what I expected going in, for sure, but I do think that there were some really interesting things at play here, and I did really appreciate the perspective of the novel. So yeah, I don't know, I think that more will kind of reveal itself to me as I sit with it more, but if you've read this, I would be very interested to hear your thoughts and some of what you feel you took from the reading experience here, what some of the explorations you think the book was interested in having are. I would be very interested to hear your perspective on that. But yeah, while it is classified as horror, again, maybe I'm a horror reader now because I wasn't necessarily scared, but it did have these larger than life supernatural elements, and there was danger, and so there were a lot of horrific elements, and there were ghost battles. And yet, I don't know, though if it were ever translated on screen, I think it might be a different story in terms of my tolerance, but that's pretty on par. So again, let me know what you're thinking. Thank you as always for hanging out and being interested in what I have to say. Again, like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, Bye.